E te iwi tēnā katoa koutou, tēnā tātou, I roto I tēnei pō. Kia ora everybody, Che Wilson here from Te Pai Pai Waho, Che's channel, and we're up to episode number 7. And with episode number 7 of Tangihanga, what we're specifically going to look at tonight is memorial services, interring of ashes, unveilings and Hāhū, all of those different kaupapa. So, before I do that, I've had a couple of questions, and so just want to cover those off before we get into the main kaupapa. So one of the questions was around cutting hair, and I'll add into that kiri kai. And then the other one is what happens when you don't have the right people to carry out the different tikanga. So I'll cover those different kaupapa. Firstly, cutting hair. So for those that don't know, there is a tradition of churich. There is a tradition where it was common for long hair to be cut when somebody passed. I only know it for women, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was the case prior to that when men had long hair as well. And yes, there's been a move back for men to have long hair again, but as I said, I only know it for women. And so that was done, and it was done, usually it was a plait and then just a straight cut. And I know some of my own family that have done it. I did think that one of my first cousins had done it for her father, but she'd actually cut her hair the week before, and then he passed. And they're all expressions of aroha, and the hair is cut and it's then placed into the usually the coffin of the loved one that's passed. There's also the tikanga around kiri hai, where people would usually have mataha or tuhua, which is the obsidian and black obsidian. Well, they're both black anyway. And that would be used to kiri hai to lacerate yourself, to cut yourself as a sign of your grief and sorrow. And sometimes if it was done deep enough, it would then be a permanent marker to remind you of the pain that you went through and the love that you showed for your loved one that had passed. So that hopefully just covers briefly one of the questions. And the other question I had was, what do you do when you don't have enough people to carry out tikanga, whether that's carrying a tūpāpaku, where you might lay your tūpāpaku, all of these different things. How would you do it? And so at the end of the day, you have to work through a process, through talking, how do you make things work? I'm mindful that it's easy for me to say, yeah, this has to happen, but that comes from a place where I've been spoilt and will usually have enough people to carry out all of the tikanga. But when you don't carry out the tikanga, when you don't have enough people to carry out the tikanga, you've got to do what works for that time and for that context. Doesn't mean that it would then have to be changed every time after that, but you have to have had your discussion with those that are there to make it work. So yeah, just wanted to cover those points before I get into the detail around subject 7, which is memorial services, interring of ashes, unveilings, Hāhū, etc. So here we go. So we've covered all of the different parts of the tangi, we've done the burial, we've had the hakari, etc., and the blessing of the house. Where there is a decision to have a memorial service, often that's done after the fact, because of different situation, and because something's happened, why you can't do it all at the funeral. And so the memorial service is then a chance to, tēnā koe rangi. So the memorial service is a chance to then celebrate that, and it's pretty much run similar to the funeral day. In addition, COVID has meant that we've had to have different services, and so whether that's just gone live or whether it's an actual interactive process. If it's interactive, you've just got to make sure that you've got somebody who's emceeing the service, officiating over the service so that it runs smoothly. Next kaupapa is around interring ashes. It's my recommendation that you do that as soon after you get the ashes. And sometimes you get them back and the urn's still warm. That's just what it is. And I try and encourage people to get it done as soon as possible, because the longer you wait, the longer it is for you to have to process and work through how you get back into normality. And even though many people have their ashes for years, it doesn't help to separate between the living and the dead, and separate between the process for grieving and then the process of returning back to some form of normality. In addition, if it's a new thing for you of holding your ashes, it's important to be careful, because you might start to hokamomori, you might start to get to a really unwell space, and it'll just take you into a dark hole if you haven't worked out how to deal with that. In addition, sometimes you then don't let your friend or your partner, your loved one, go. And so making sure that you inter the ashes will help you to let them go. And sometimes people might not realize, but they're using it as an excuse just to hold on, and haven't realized, oh no, they're waiting for someone else to let it go first before they do. And actually that hasn't been discussed. So all of those things you've got to work out. And I encourage people to move through the process quicker, because it's a physical remnants of the person. You haven't actually let them go. You haven't put them to sleep fully. So that's memorial services, that's interring ashes. Before I get into the unveilings and or Hāhū, a lot of people ask, oh, why the 1 year? And when I was growing up, all the nanas and the aunties, they all wore black. They wore black for a whole year. And granted, black is a Victorian tikanga, but it's the tikanga around the 1 year, which is the Māori thing. And now that the likes of Rangimā Tāmua and others have started to share a lot of the tikanga around the stars, that's where the 1 year comes from. And that there's only once a year when the kupenga of Taramainuku rises above the horizon and casts the wairua of everybody that have passed on into the heavens to become stars. And there's a really common phrase that's used which supports this kōrero, koutou ko he tūrangitia, those of you that have passed on to become stars. We say it all of the time, and it's not just a Mufasa thing from The Lion King, but the whole year process comes from that tikanga Māori around releasing our loved ones to become stars. And whether they are sitting in the kupenga, sitting in Te Hāorua, or Te Nohoanga Rangitikiwa, they're all in a similar place, actually, those three areas. Whatever it is, it's that 1 year comes from the tikanga Māori. And that's where the whole unveiling, and it being such a big thing, came from. And so normally a year, but it doesn't need to be a year. It can be 2 years, it might even be longer. But there's a time where you unveil. And that process is held. The normal process, as I know it, would normally be you have a pōhere, welcome everybody along. You might then have a service at the marae and then go out to Rurupa and conduct a service there, unveil, return back, hakari, finished. That's one process. One thing that's really interesting is to note is that unveilings are becoming really expensive. And so work within your means, don't work based on social pressure. And it's important to make sure that you work within your means and do what you can do so that you can recognise your loved one, but don't make it a financial noose around your back. With regard to Hāhū, Hāhū is the process to exhume the bones. And traditionally you would wait long enough for the flesh to have fallen off the bones. You exhume the bones, clean them, occasionally then paint them with kōkōwai, not always, but occasionally, and then take the bones to a rua koiwi or an ana, to a cave, where the bones would then be looked after. Some cultures still do that today. And it all just depends, and we need to be mindful as things change that as we lose space and all of that, you just got to make it work. And so that's Hāhū, and I've done these really quickly, just to some key bits, because next week I'm going to do a summary. I'm in his room. Going to do a summary and then cover off some of the more topical points that people asked about over this time. But in wrapping up, I see a point from Val. What's really important is we have tikanga Māori, and we have things that we have adopted from European culture. People then add tikanga Māori kōrero to those things. And the classic example is black kakahupango, black clothes. It is a Victorian tikanga, and even though people say that the black represents the poor, which that colour may do, the tikanga itself has come from England. But as we try to reframe some of these English tikanga, you then get the creolisation or the mixing up. And it's a bit like the maimai or the taua. You know, I've covered the reasons why we wear the greenery around the head, but then others have added that, well, it represents the crown of thorns, which even my queer talked about, but it was used before Christianity even got here. So there are some tikanga that are strictly ours. There are tikanga that we've adopted from overseas, and then it's reframing some of those adopted tikanga to fit our context, but it still comes from somewhere else. Ka te ake. Hopefully that's enough. It's a nice short session tonight, but it's still too long. Hoi anō, e mihi ana kia koutou, kia tātou katoa I roto I tēnei pō, kia wakaere ake ngā kupu, ki te tā uu nui, orangi nui e tūnei, turuturu au I te waka maua kia tīna, haumia, hui e, tāiki. Kia ora tātou.